Ma'am, step away from the suitcase. Right now. The voice cracked across Terminal C like a thunderclap, sharp enough to turn heads from 50 feet away. Conversation stopped. Rolling carry-on slowed. Even the distant hum of announcements seemed to fade beneath the sudden tension gathering near Gate 22. Naomi Brooks froze beside the baggage carousel, one hand resting lightly on the handle of her navy blue suitcase. For a brief moment, she thought the officer must be speaking to someone else. Then she noticed every eye in the area shifting toward her. The German Shepherd standing beside Airport Police Officer Derek Collins had locked onto her luggage, its posture rigid, ears forward, nose fixed on the bag, as if it had discovered something dangerous. Derek's hand hovered near his radio. Step away from it, he repeated. Naomi slowly released the handle. Around her, travelers instinctively took a few cautious steps backward. A mother pulled her young son closer. A businessman lowered his phone and stared. Someone whispered, "What happened?" Another voice answered, "Must be drugs." Naomi kept her expression calm, though she could already feel the familiar weight settling across her shoulders. The weight that came whenever people reached a conclusion before asking a single question. Bright morning sunlight poured through the massive airport windows, reflecting across polished floors and chrome railings. Just 20 minutes earlier, everything had felt ordinary. Her flight from Atlanta had landed on schedule. She had grabbed her suitcase and started toward the exit. Today was supposed to be simple. A new city, a new assignment, a fresh start. Instead, she now stood in the center of a growing circle of strangers watching her, as if she had already been found guilty of something. Derek glanced at his partner. Secure the area. Another officer moved forward immediately. Naomi noticed how quickly they acted. No hesitation. No questions. No introductions. The decision seemed already made. Officer, Naomi said evenly. Is there a problem? Derek's eyes narrowed. You can answer questions after we inspect the bag. His tone carried the confidence of someone certain he was about to prove himself right. Naomi nodded once. She had spent 2 decades in law enforcement. She recognized that look. The look of a person who had stopped investigating and started assuming. The airport's giant departure board flickered overhead, bathing the terminal in shifting blue light. Somewhere nearby, a coffee machine hissed. A child laughed. Life continued moving around them. Yet inside the growing circle surrounding Naomi, everything felt strangely still. One of the officers unzipped the suitcase. Shirts, shoes, a folded jacket, travel documents. Nothing unusual. Yet Derek remained focused. The dog continued signaling toward the luggage. More officers arrived. More spectators gathered. Several phones appeared. Tiny cameras pointed in her direction. Naomi could practically feel the recording lights aimed at her face. Interesting, Derek muttered. He exchanged a glance with his supervisor, Sergeant Ryan Walker, who had just arrived from the security office. Ryan looked at Naomi briefly before turning toward the suitcase. What do we have? He asked. Derek straightened. Possible smuggling case. The words landed heavily in the air. Naomi heard a woman nearby gasp. Another traveler immediately started recording more aggressively. Smuggling. The accusation spread through the crowd faster than facts ever could. Ryan's expression hardened. Ma'am, we'll need you to come with us. Naomi studied both men quietly. The terminal lights reflected off the polished badge clipped to Ryan's chest. Beyond him, passengers hurried toward connecting flights, completely unaware that something much bigger had just begun. Naomi took a slow breath and lifted her chin. Somewhere deep inside, an instinct she had trusted for years suddenly stirred awake. This didn't feel like a misunderstanding. It felt like the opening move of something far more dangerous. The security office sat 3 levels below the terminal, hidden behind a maze of gray hallways and access-controlled doors. The deeper Naomi Brooks walked into the airport, the colder the air seemed to become. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Their pale glow reflected off polished concrete floors that looked untouched by sunlight. Officer Derek Collins walked beside her, while Sergeant Ryan Walker followed several steps behind. Neither man said much. Neither seemed interested in hearing her side of the story. Naomi noticed the silence. It was the kind that formed when people believed they already knew who someone was. Inside interview room 3, a metal table stood beneath a ceiling camera. A digital clock on the wall displayed 10:17 a.m. Naomi sat calmly, and folded her hands in front of her. The chair felt stiff beneath her back. Outside the small window in the door, officers moved through the hallway carrying folders and radios. Nobody looked in her direction. Nobody seemed curious. Derek entered carrying a thin case file. He dropped it onto the table and took the seat opposite her. Ryan remained standing against the wall. His arms stayed crossed the entire time. Naomi glanced briefly at the folder. Empty. No reports. No evidence. Just a prop designed to make the room feel official. Derek leaned forward. Let us make this easy. Naomi met his eyes without speaking. Where were you before Atlanta? He asked. Washington, D.C., Naomi replied. And before that? Chicago. Derek wrote something down. Interesting. Naomi almost smiled. There was nothing interesting about any of it. 20 years in law enforcement had taught her how interviews worked. She recognized every technique, every pause, every attempt to create pressure where none existed. Through the narrow room window, she could see rain beginning to streak across the distant runway. A line of passenger jets sat motionless beneath darkening clouds. For a moment, she thought about how different the morning had looked when her flight landed. She had boarded that plane carrying nothing more than a suitcase, a travel mug, and a quiet sense of purpose. Few people knew she was coming. Fewer still knew why. Derek opened the suitcase inventory report. You travel often? Naomi nodded. When work requires it. What kind of work? Ryan finally asked. His voice carried a sharper edge than Derek's. Naomi looked toward him. Public service. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly. He clearly did not appreciate vague answers. Neither officer realized how close they stood to the truth. Naomi studied the room carefully. Years of investigative work had trained her to notice details others ignored. A coffee stain beneath the far cabinet. A cracked corner on the security monitor. An evidence log hanging beside the door with 2 missing entries. Small things. Yet small things often revealed larger problems. The clock ticked louder than before. 10:23. 10:24. 10:25. Outside, activity in the hallway continued normally. Nobody appeared concerned about the unusual circumstances surrounding her detention. That bothered Naomi more than the accusation itself. Procedures existed for a reason. Good officers respected them. Great officers depended on them. Yet everything she had witnessed since stepping off the plane felt rushed. Convenient. Predetermined. As though someone had decided the outcome before the process began. Derek suddenly received a radio message. His expression changed for only a fraction of a second. Most people would have missed it. Naomi did not. The officer quickly stood. Stay here. Naomi watched him leave. The door clicked shut behind him. Ryan remained by the wall. Rain tapped softly against a distant window somewhere beyond the corridor. Naomi sat perfectly still. Then she noticed something unusual. Through the narrow glass panel in the door, a man in an airport maintenance uniform hurried past carrying a black equipment case. For an instant, their eyes met. The man immediately looked away and disappeared around the corner. Naomi felt a faint chill move through her chest. Her instincts had been warning her since the terminal. Now they spoke louder. This was not simply a mistake. Someone was nervous. And nervous people usually had something to hide. Derek Collins stood inside the operations office overlooking the security checkpoint, his reflection faintly visible in the dark glass as rain continued to drift across the runways outside. Nearly 30 feet below, travelers moved through the terminal unaware of the storm quietly building inside the airport. He should have felt satisfied. Most officers would. The incident was already spreading. Through internal channels. Several employees had heard about the suspected smuggling case. A few had even congratulated him. Yet something about Naomi Brooks continued to bother him. She had not acted nervous. She had not argued. She had not panicked. Every person he had ever detained carried some trace of fear, frustration, or urgency. Naomi carried none of it. Sergeant Ryan Walker stepped into the office holding a tablet. Public relations already knows, he said. They want updates every hour. Derek nodded. Good. Ryan glanced toward the interview wing. You still think she is involved? Derek hesitated. Only for a second. The dog alerted. Ryan did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the tablet onto a nearby desk and folded his arms. The room fell quiet except for the steady hum of computer servers. Along one wall, surveillance monitors displayed live camera feeds from baggage claim, security checkpoints, employee entrances, and maintenance corridors. Hundreds of people moved through those screens every minute. Thousands every day. Most went unnoticed. Ryan finally spoke. Sometimes the biggest cases start looking ordinary. Derek appreciated that answer. It reinforced everything he wanted to believe. Across the room, a young officer named Melissa Grant reviewed airport security footage. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. She had only been with the department 18 months, but she possessed the kind of attention to detail that made senior officers nervous. Melissa frowned at her screen, then frowned again. "Sergeant." Ryan turned. "What?" Melissa zoomed in on a hallway camera. The image showed a maintenance worker carrying a black equipment case through a restricted service corridor less than an hour earlier. "This man," she said quietly. Ryan stepped closer. "What about him?" Melissa tapped several keys. Another camera angle appeared. Then another. The same worker. The same black case. Different locations. Different times. His access pattern does not make sense. Derek approached the monitor. "Explain." Melissa pointed toward a timestamp. According to badge records, he entered the West Maintenance Wing at 9:43. She opened another file. But this camera shows him exiting from the east side 4 minutes later. Derek stared at the screen. The distance between those two locations was nearly half a mile. No one could cross it in 4 minutes without passing multiple checkpoints. Melissa swallowed. Either the timestamps are wrong or somebody altered access records. The room suddenly felt smaller. Ryan's expression hardened. "Pull every camera angle you can find." Melissa nodded and immediately got back to work. Derek looked once more at the image of the maintenance worker. Something about the man's posture seemed familiar. Not his face. His behavior. The deliberate effort to avoid attention. The same behavior Derek had spent years learning to recognize. Down the hall, behind a secured door, Naomi Brooks sat alone in interview room 3. Unaware of it, the first crack had just appeared in the story everyone had been so eager to believe. The rain intensified outside, turning the airport windows into sheets of blurred silver. Inside interview room 3, Naomi Brooks sat quietly beneath the steady glow of fluorescent lights. The digital clock on the wall now read 10:48 a.m. Nearly an hour had passed since she had been escorted from the terminal, yet no formal evidence had been presented, no clear explanation had been given, and no one seemed interested in answering the questions that mattered most. She rested her hands calmly on the table and listened. The building spoke if a person paid attention. Footsteps moved faster than before. Radios crackled more frequently. Doors opened and closed with unusual urgency. Something had changed. Down the hallway, Officer Melissa Grant continued reviewing footage frame by frame. Her monitor displayed a maze of service corridors, maintenance entrances, storage rooms, and employee checkpoints. The same maintenance worker appeared again. This time the image was clearer. He carried the black equipment case through a restricted access corridor at 9:11 a.m., almost 40 minutes before Naomi's flight arrived at the gate. Melissa enlarged the frame. The man's employee badge swung briefly into view. She froze. "Sergeant," she called. Ryan Walker looked up immediately. "What is it?" Melissa pointed toward the screen. "This badge belongs to someone who retired 6 months ago." The room fell silent. Derek stepped closer. "That is not possible." Melissa opened another database window. A personnel file appeared. The photograph matched the man on the camera almost perfectly, except for one problem. The employee listed in the file was 72 years old and living in Arizona. The man in the footage looked closer to 40. Ryan's expression darkened. Someone cloned the credentials. Derek stared at the screen. For the first time all morning, uncertainty began pushing against his confidence. Meanwhile, Naomi remained seated inside the interview room. A young officer entered carrying a bottle of water and placed it gently on the table. Unlike the others, she seemed uncomfortable. "Thank you," Naomi said. The officer hesitated. "Ma'am, can I ask you something?" Naomi nodded. "Have you ever been through something like this before?" The question lingered between them. Naomi looked down at the unopened bottle. "Not exactly this," she answered softly. "But I have spent enough years in public service to know that assumptions can travel faster than facts." The young officer lowered her eyes. She seemed to understand. A moment later, she quietly left the room. Back in the operations center, Melissa uncovered another anomaly. The surveillance feed covering baggage handling had gone offline for exactly 6 minutes that morning. Not 5, not 7, 6 minutes. long enough for someone to move unnoticed. Too precise to be an accident. Ryan rubbed his jaw. Pull maintenance records. Melissa typed rapidly. Seconds later, another report appeared. Her eyes widened. The outage was manually triggered. Derek felt a knot form in his stomach. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. The image of Naomi, sitting calmly in the interview room, returned to his mind. She had never once demanded special treatment. She had never raised her voice. She had simply asked that procedures be followed. Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the runways. Inside, a far more dangerous storm was beginning to reveal itself. And for the first time that day, Derek Collins started wondering whether the wrong person had been sitting in interview room 3 all along. By 11:17 a.m., the atmosphere inside the airport police unit had changed completely. The confidence that had filled the operations center earlier was slowly being replaced by unease. Melissa Grant sat surrounded by open files, security logs, and surveillance reports. Every new record seemed to point toward the same conclusion. Someone had carefully constructed a path through the airport's security system. Someone who understood cameras. Someone who understood access controls. Someone who knew exactly where blind spots existed. Rain continued tapping against the windows as she opened another maintenance report. Then she froze. "Sergeant," she said quietly. Ryan Walker looked up from his desk. "What now?" Melissa turned her monitor toward him. "The black equipment case." Ryan stepped closer. Derek followed immediately. The screen displayed footage from a service elevator recorded earlier that morning. The maintenance worker entered carrying the case. For minutes later, he exited without it. Derek narrowed his eyes. Where did he leave it? Melissa brought up another camera angle. A storage room near baggage handling appeared on the screen. The same equipment case sat against a wall for nearly 18 minutes before someone entered and moved it again. Derek felt his pulse quicken. "Track it." Melissa nodded and opened additional footage. The case appeared in one hallway. Then another. Then another. Each movement seemed random until the final camera angle appeared. The room fell silent. The black case had been wheeled directly into the baggage processing area assigned to Flight 284 from Atlanta. Naomi's flight. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The only sound came from the steady hum of computers. Derek stared at the screen. His certainty continued slipping away piece by piece. Meanwhile, Naomi remained inside interview room 3. The bottle of water sat unopened beside her. She glanced toward the clock. Nearly 2 hours had passed. Her instincts told her the investigation outside was beginning to catch up with reality. The truth often moved slowly at first. Then all at once, through the small window, she noticed officers walking past more frequently now. Several carried folders. Others spoke in hushed voices. Something had shifted. The door opened. Derek entered alone. He looked different, less certain, less comfortable. He sat across from her and opened a notebook. "I need to ask another question." Naomi nodded calmly. "Go ahead." Derek hesitated. "Have you ever worked investigations involving internal corruption?" Naomi studied him for a moment. It was the first genuine question he had asked all day. "Yes," she answered. Derek looked down at the table. "Those cases difficult?" Naomi folded her hands. "The hardest ones." "Why?" She glanced toward the rain-covered window beyond the hallway. "Because people expect danger to come from strangers. They rarely expect it to come from inside their own organization." The answer lingered in the room. Derek looked away first. Outside, Melissa suddenly called out from the operations center. Her voice echoed through the corridor. "I found something." Officers immediately gathered around her desk. Naomi could not hear the details from where she sat. She did not need to. The reaction alone told her enough. Somewhere inside the airport, a carefully hidden secret was beginning to unravel. And whoever had built the trap was running out of places to hide. The operations center became unusually quiet after Melissa's discovery. Nobody celebrated. Nobody spoke louder than necessary. Experienced officers understood what moments like this meant. The investigation had crossed an invisible line. They were no longer searching for possibilities. They were following evidence. Rain continued sliding down the airport windows in long silver trails, blurring the lights of taxiing aircraft beyond the runway. Inside interview room 3, Naomi Brooks sat alone once more. The hallway outside had grown calmer. The hurried footsteps from earlier had faded. In their place came something different. Reflection, uncertainty, doubt. She leaned back slightly, and watched the second hand move around the wall clock. Tick, tick, tick. Every passing second reminded her of a lesson her father had taught her years ago. Truth rarely arrived first. Assumptions always traveled faster. But truth lasted longer. Somewhere above the ceiling, a jet engine roared as another flight departed into the storm. The sound faded slowly into the distance. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment. Not because she was tired, because she was listening. Listening to the building. Listening to the silence between events. The same silence investigators often overlooked. Down the corridor, Derek Collins stood alone near a window overlooking the service road. His reflection stared back at him through the glass. The image looked older than it had that morning. Less certain. Less proud. He remembered the confidence he had felt when the dog first alerted to the suitcase. He remembered the crowd gathering. The phone's recording. The certainty in his own voice. Now that certainty felt heavy. Melissa approached quietly carrying a folder. "You should see this." Derek turned. Inside the folder were access logs connected to the cloned employee badge. Every entry led back to the same location. A maintenance office near Cargo Bay 4. Derek studied the documents carefully. Then his eyes stopped on a familiar name. His stomach tightened. That cannot be right. Melissa nodded slowly. "I checked 3 times. The office assigned to the cloned credentials had been authorized by a supervisor. Not a maintenance supervisor. Not an airport administrator. A police supervisor." Derek looked up. The rain outside suddenly seemed louder. "Who signed it?" Melissa hesitated. "Sergeant Ryan Walker." The words landed like a stone in still water. Neither of them spoke. For several seconds, the only sound came from distant thunder rolling across the airfield. Derek looked through the glass wall toward Ryan's office. The door was closed. The lights were off. He had not seen Ryan in nearly 20 minutes. A cold feeling settled into his chest. Meanwhile, Naomi remained seated in the interview room, unaware of the exact details unfolding beyond the walls. Yet she sensed the shift. The atmosphere had changed. Earlier, she had been treated like a problem to solve. Now she felt like a question nobody could answer. The door opened softly. The young officer who had brought her water stepped inside again. This time her expression carried something closer to concern. She placed a fresh cup of coffee on the table. "You have been very patient today," she said quietly. Naomi offered a small smile. "Patience is easier when you trust the truth." The officer looked down at the cup before meeting Naomi's eyes. "I think the truth is finally catching up." At 11:42 a.m., the storm outside finally began to break. Thin bands of sunlight pushed through the clouds and spilled across the wet runways, turning puddles into sheets of gold. Inside the airport police unit, however, the tension only deepened. Derek Collins stood motionless in front of Melissa Grant's workstation, staring at the authorization records that connected Sergeant Ryan Walker to the cloned maintenance credentials. The numbers did not lie. The timestamps did not lie. Every path led back to the same place. Every answer pointed toward the same person. Derek felt the ground beneath his assumptions begin to shift. Before he could speak, the elevator doors at the far end of the operations center opened. Every conversation stopped. Several officers turned instinctively toward the sound. A group of senior officials stepped into the room. Their polished shoes clicked softly against the floor. At the center walked Deputy Chief Harold Bennett. His silver hair was damp from the rain, and his expression carried none of the warmth usually seen during official visits. He moved with purpose. The entire room seemed to straighten around him. Derek immediately stepped forward. "Sir." Bennett did not answer. His eyes swept across the operations center before settling on Melissa's monitors. Then he looked toward the hallway leading to interview room 3. "Where is she?" The question echoed through the room. Derek blinked. "Sir." Bennett's voice hardened. "Where is Captain Naomi Brooks?" The silence that followed felt endless. Several officers exchanged confused glances. Melissa froze beside her desk. Derek felt every muscle in his body tighten. "Captain." The word hung in the air like a suspended weight. Bennett took a slow breath. "Captain Brooks was scheduled to report here this morning." No one moved. No one spoke. She was personally assigned by Internal Affairs to oversee a department-wide review. Bennett's gaze shifted from face to face. A review involving evidence handling procedures, access control failures, and potential corruption within this unit. The room seemed to shrink around Derek. His thoughts raced backward through the entire morning. The terminal. The accusation. The suitcase. The interview room. Every moment returned at once. Across the operations center, a chair scraped softly against the floor. Someone dropped a pen. Nobody seemed to notice. Bennett looked directly at Derek. "I asked a question, Officer Collins." Derek swallowed. His mouth felt dry. "Interview room 3, sir." Bennett's expression darkened. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the hallway. Officers quickly stepped aside. Doors opened. Footsteps followed. The entire unit seemed drawn in the same direction. Inside interview room 3, Naomi Brooks sat calmly with her untouched coffee. Sunlight now filtered through the narrow hallway window, replacing the cold gray light that had filled the room all morning. The door opened. Naomi looked up. Deputy Chief Bennett entered first. The moment he saw her, he stopped. Then, without hesitation, he extended his hand. "Captain Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology." The hallway behind him became perfectly silent. Officers filled the doorway. Derek stood among them, unable to look away. Naomi rose slowly from her chair. Her posture remained steady. Her expression remained calm. Nothing about her suggested triumph. Nothing suggested anger. She simply accepted the handshake. Around her, the room filled with people finally seeing what had been standing in front of them all along. The hallway remained silent long after Deputy Chief Bennett spoke. Nobody seemed certain what to do with the truth now that it stood plainly in front of them. Sunlight stretched across the polished floor, reflecting off badges, glass doors, and the rows of stunned faces gathered outside interview room 3. Naomi Brooks calmly picked up the untouched cup of coffee and set it aside. She looked neither offended nor triumphant. Years in law enforcement had taught her that people often revealed their character most clearly in moments like this. Deputy Chief Bennett stepped aside and gestured toward the operations center. "Captain, there are several matters we need to discuss immediately." Naomi nodded. As she walked down the hallway, officers moved aside without being asked. Some lowered their eyes. Others stared at the floor. A few looked genuinely ashamed. Derek Collins followed several steps behind. The confidence that had carried him through the morning had vanished completely. Inside the operations center, Melissa Grant stood beside her workstation. Multiple screens displayed access logs, surveillance footage, personnel records, and maintenance reports. Naomi studied the evidence carefully. Her attention moved from one detail to another with quiet precision. She did not rush. She did not speculate. After several minutes, she pointed toward one of the screens. "Who reviewed these authorization requests?" Melissa glanced toward the file. "Sergeant Walker signed every one of them." Naomi nodded slowly. "And where is Sergeant Walker now?" Nobody answered. The question lingered in the room. Deputy Chief Bennett looked toward a nearby lieutenant. "Find him." The lieutenant immediately left. Naomi continued examining the evidence. The cloned credentials, the disabled cameras, the missing 6 minutes of surveillance footage, the carefully planned movements through restricted areas. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. This had never been about a random traveler. Someone had expected a specific outcome. Someone had wanted attention focused in exactly the wrong direction. Several minutes later, the lieutenant returned. His expression said everything before he spoke. "Sir, Sergeant Walker left the building approximately 25 minutes ago." A heavy silence settled across the room. Naomi remained calm. "Then we continue with facts." She turned toward Melissa. "Excellent work." Melissa blinked. The simple praise seemed to catch her off guard. "Thank you, Captain." Naomi offered a small smile. "You followed evidence instead of assumptions. Never stop doing that." Across the room, Derek lowered his gaze. The words struck harder than any criticism could have. Naomi noticed. She walked toward him and stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. Derek finally broke the silence. "Captain, I owe you an apology." His voice was quiet but sincere. "I made judgments before I had the facts." Naomi looked at him steadily. The operations center seemed to hold its breath. "Officer Collins," she said softly, "the purpose of this badge is not to prove we are right. The purpose is to help us find the truth." Derek nodded slowly. The words settled heavily in the room. No lecture. No humiliation. No anger. Just a lesson delivered with dignity. Outside the windows, the storm clouds continued drifting away. Sunlight spread across the runways, illuminating aircraft preparing for departure. Inside the airport police unit, something else was beginning to clear as well. For the first time that day, The focus was no longer on the woman who had been accused. It was on the truth she had quietly helped reveal. The following Monday morning arrived bright and clear. The storm that had blanketed the city only days earlier was gone, replaced by a crisp blue sky stretching endlessly above the airport. Sunlight poured through the glass walls of the administration building, casting long reflections across polished floors and quiet hallways. At exactly 8 o'clock, officers began filing into the main briefing room. The atmosphere felt different from any meeting they could remember. Conversations were quieter. Movements were slower. People seemed more aware of one another than before. At the front of the room stood an empty podium beside a neatly folded American flag. Rows of chairs gradually filled. Melissa Grant took a seat near the front. Derek Collins chose a place farther back. He sat silently, hands folded together, his thoughts fixed on everything that had happened over the past several days. The door opened. The room immediately fell silent. Naomi Brooks entered wearing her dress uniform. The gold captain bars on her collar reflected the morning light. Her posture remained calm and steady, exactly as it had been. Throughout the entire ordeal, she walked toward the podium without rushing, without hesitation, without resentment. Every eye followed her. Deputy Chief Bennett stood and formally introduced her to the department. His words were brief, respectful. When he finished, Naomi stepped forward. The room remained completely still. She looked across the faces before her. Some familiar, some not. Then she spoke. The strength of a department is not measured by how often it is right. Her voice carried easily through the room. It is measured by how honestly it responds when it is wrong. Nobody moved. Nobody looked away. Trust is not built through authority alone. It is built through fairness, through patience, through the willingness to follow facts wherever they lead. Her eyes briefly swept across the room. They paused for only a moment when they reached Derek, then continued. Every person who enters our airport deserves the same thing. Respect before judgment. Process before assumptions. Truth before conclusions. The words settled gently over the room. No accusations. No public embarrassment. No attempt to settle scores. Only principles. The kind that lasted longer than anger ever could. When the meeting ended, officers slowly rose from their seats. Conversations began again. Quieter this time. More thoughtful. Derek remained where he was. As people filtered out of the room, Naomi approached him. He immediately stood. "Captain." Naomi offered a small nod. For a second, neither spoke. Then Derek said the one thing he had been carrying for days. "I will spend a long time earning back the lesson you taught me." Naomi's expression softened slightly. "Then make sure you teach it to someone else one day." Derek nodded. That was all. No dramatic moment. No grand gesture. Just understanding. Hours later, the airport moved with its usual rhythm. Travelers hurried toward gates. Aircraft lifted into the afternoon sky. Announcements echoed through the terminals. Life continued. From her new office overlooking the runways, Naomi stood beside the window and watched a departing jet climb into the sunlight. Far below, tiny figures crossed the terminal floor, each carrying a story. Nobody else could see. She rested one hand lightly on the windowsill. The glass felt warm beneath the afternoon sun. Behind her, the office remained quiet. Ahead of her, the runway stretched toward the horizon. And in that quiet moment, with the storm finally behind them, the airport seemed to breathe a little easier. So did everyone inside it.